told for centuries and that have all touched us in one way or another. It's a story that's inspired artists and writers and filmmakers, produce all sorts of stories and movies that have that spirit of Christmas with it. It's a story filled with majesty and mystery. This night, that gospel is being proclaimed all around the world. In many places, children and children liturgies are doing Christmas pageants or doing some form of nativity scene to help make that story at home for them. So think about that. Reminded when I was a child for some years, my siblings and I used to put on the nativity story. We would practice, and on Christmas Eve we'd go, and in front of the Christmas tree, we'd put on our costumes, okay? If you were a shepherd, I bet you had a towel over your head, the belt tied around, okay? Let's see, if you were the angel, you were standing on a tree or on a chair, and it had a sheet, you were kind of flapping your wings that way. Joseph wore a bathrobe. My only sister, the only girl, she of course was Mary, and one of her dolls was the baby Jesus. And we put this large production on in front of 2 people. Sometimes we had a narrator that would explain the story, sometimes we backed it out. But we very much, brought that story into our hearts by bringing it into our home. Now, the Christmas story is so familiar to us. We just take it as part of our faith tradition or cultural tradition. It just kind of makes sense because that's the way it's always been. But I have to say, at the time of Jesus' birth, to have God send his son to be born as a human being was unimaginable. Okay? Most of the cultural sensitivities of they learned things from Greek culture, and it followed in Roman culture and some Jewish culture, and that had a sense that there were kind of 2 realities and 2 worlds. And one world was the spirit world, and that's where God resided, or sometimes the gods. The Greeks and Romans said gods, and that was a pure world and a good world. And the other world was the material world, and that's where human beings lived, and that was fallen and defiled and impure. And rarely would God come and have much to do with the material world. Even in Jewish culture, especially for the Sadducees, they felt that God didn't really have any connection to any individual, had no specific plan or design for that person. It was just kind of distant, kind of like on the other side of the universe. So to think that God, the God of all gods, would send his son to live a human life was, like I said, unthinkable. And that's what God did. And in that process, it kind of destroyed, from a Christian standpoint, this separation of just the spiritual world and the material world. Because we start to think back to the beginning of the Bible, the book of Genesis, we see where God created things. It says God says it's good. It's very good. And so the fact that the Word became flesh and dwelt among us elevated all of creation. The importance of creation and how creation works together, for the will of God. And it sanctified human life because Jesus was born of a woman and then lived this human life. Again, that was beyond our understanding, but we kind of sit here and just take that for granted. And yet it means that all of us have some purpose, that we experience God with us, Emmanuel, in and through so many different things. That God is with us, that God is present to us. Christmas time, it's easy to see how we do that. We have a manger scene, okay? And that came from St. Francis of Assisi in the year 1223, where he developed the first manger scene. And what people did is, we need to put this in our church. We call the Nativity. What a great story we just heard from Luke's Gospel. But not only that, it just doesn't have to be in the church. It can be in our homes, okay? Because God is with us. It elevates human life and all creation. Some depictions of the Nativity have the ox and the donkey there. Well, part of their role in this is, in some depictions, you see them kind of breathing down on the infant Jesus, and on a cold night, their breath is keeping the baby warm. You see, they have a part. They have a role, just as all of us do. And so Christmas is full of all these signs and symbols that remind us, most of all, that God is with us, which is the whole sense of the incarnation. God is with us. And so we have evergreen trees, which is a symbol that in the dead of winter, when all the trees are bare, when leaves are dead and decaying on the ground, that there's hope for something new. There's hope for greater life. There's hope to move beyond darkness and sin into the light that is Christ. Or we look at the wreaths, the circular wreaths, remind us of the eternal love of God for his people, the never-ending love that goes on and on. And of course, Christmas is all about lights, right? I mean, we have thousands of lights here. We have lights in our homes again, reminding us of the light across to lead us out of darkness. You ever go into the room with just one candle or one light burning and how that little bit of light can just pervade the room? Well, that helps us to really experience God's grace, even in our most difficult moments. So I challenge you to know that light will lead us somewhere. There is some meaning and purpose of things because God is with us. God is with us. And so, as we gather to celebrate, we want to see where is that God in our life? Where do we experience God? We have all these things. And Christmas is full of sights, of scents, of sounds. Christmas is full of songs, right? I mean, we have a wonderful tradition of hymns that we sing in church especially, right? Joy to the world, O come away faithful, a sign of night. What child of this? The way in the manger, a long list of these wonderful songs. There's also wonderful secular songs, some that make kind of the canon of Christmas. Some are better than others, but some are just, you hear those songs and they're covered by thousands of artists because they're such good songs. And I want to reflect on one of those songs for a minute here, and that is I'll Be Home for Christmas. Okay, I'll Be Home for Christmas. The familiar song was written 70 years ago in 1943. So guess what was going on then, right? Middle of World War II. And here's a song saying I'll be home for Christmas. For many, many, many people who are a world away, in Europe, North Africa, the Pacific, and military installations all around the world who are not going to be home for Christmas, they're fighting war. And the reality is some of those are never going to get home for Christmas again. And yet there is that hope that, let there be snow and mistletoe and presents on the tree. On the tree. Okay, that was the original lyric. Now we say under the tree because the presents have gotten bigger, more plentiful, right? So there's that longing to be home. Why do people long to be home for Christmas? Because that's where experience probably the most profound loves of our life, right? And our spouses, our parents, our children, our grandparents, our relatives, our friends, our neighbors. And God is love because God so loved the world, he sent his only Son. The incarnation, where the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. And we want to be home for Christmas, but sometimes we just aren't. Mary and Joseph weren't home for Christmas, were they? They had to leave Nazareth to go to Bethlehem. And as the Christmas story continues, in short order, they have to flee to Egypt. Okay? But the point about being home is sometimes we can't be home, but God is home with us. Okay? And so this day, as we think about I'll be home for Christmas, there are people who aren't home this day because they're away fighting war. There are people who are away because they're fighting with loved ones and family members, with neighbors who just live across town or even across the street. But the incarnation with God with us means it's a chance for us to be our best selves, to try to get that Christmas spirit and that grace of God and be the best people we can be, and to be the first one to offer forgiveness or reconciliation or to receive that forgiveness from someone else. God is with us, and that's how we're home for Christmas. When we were kids and acting out that nativity story, growing up with 5 boys and 1 girl, we had lots of fights and bickering and sibling rivalries and competitiveness. But I tell you, when we'd work on that, nobody fought. We all got it. We put on this production. My parents had to sit there, oh my God, look how good these kids can be. Huh? But they had to know that came because of the story, because of the faith in the story, and that story touched us. And so tonight, as we celebrate Christmas, I invite us all, to allow that sense of God with us to become the best person he created us to be. And to all its wonder. And allow that grace for God to course through our veins and to warm our hearts. To enlighten our minds with wisdom and to illumine our world with the light of Christ. I'll be home for Christmas. We may not be home, but God always has a home